Hello everyone, and welcome to Mr. This is Africa, and there's Egypt. Now let's go, shall we? There aren't many countries as ancient as Egypt. It was here, beside the waters of the world's longest river, the Nile, that one of the first civilizations was born. Before this riverside birth, the ancient peoples of Egypt are but dimly viewed through the thick sands of time. Paleolithic shadows of rugged hunters, assuming more definite shapes as the Neolithic era sees the people constructing simple settlements and practicing agriculture, introduced perhaps from Mesopotamia. Various cultures arose along the banks of the Nile and eventually tried their hand at crafting things. They were not very good at it yet, but at least they were trying. Now the Nile flows from the south to the Mediterranean in the north. The land here is higher up and the river flows down from here, so this region is called Upper Egypt, making this Lower Egypt. And the several separate cultures that germinated along the river coalesced into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower, as the increasingly clever Egyptians developed one of the first systems of writing, hieroglyphs. Now of course kings wanted to rule both bits, and the man credited with accomplishing this is Narmer. This pellet here shows him wearing the crown of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Thus, the first dynasty of Egypt was established 5,000 years ago, and a few centuries passed and things are rather quiet, and then whoa, what is going on? We're in the third dynasty, the beginning of what's called Egypt's Old Kingdom, its first epoch of greatness. Now where did this monumentality of architecture spring from? Two places. First, the absolute power of the monarch, who in this case was King Djoser, who controlled everything and could compel the construction of enormous buildings for his glory. Second, this man here, Imhotep, Djoser's prime minister, the great architect, inventor of the pyramid, a man of such immense genius and ability that the Egyptians and later the Greeks worshipped him as a god. Before Imhotep, Egyptian architecture was mediocre and nondescript. After him it was the grandest in the world. Naturally over time the buildings grew more grandiose and culminate in the Great Pyramids of Giza. The biggest of them is attributed to King Khufu, finished around 2560 BC, and represents in its enormity the bursting energy, creativity, wealth, organization and zeal of Old Kingdom Egypt. The precision of workmanship and amount of time and effort involved in building the pyramids is something seen elsewhere in Egyptian culture. Mummification of one body took months, and think of the time involved to craft and paint the multiple coffins people were buried in, which they assumed no one would ever see. But how exactly were these triangular titans assembled? No one is certain. The reason Egyptians carefully preserved the dead was because they believed only well-maintained bodies had a shot at afterlife admittance. You also had to make sure that your heart was literally as light as a feather from goodness, or a hybrid monster demon would eat your tainted heart and you would be damned forever. Anyway, the Old Kingdom collapsed amid natural disasters and civil war, and Egypt entered a dark age of division and decrepitude, until it was reunited by King Mentuhotep, and the Middle Kingdom era began. This was not so magnificent an era, but it had its moments. Pyramids were still built, but they were smaller and cheaper, made of mud brick rather than stone. This chapter of Egypt preferred obelisks and pylon gates, and had its heyday under Amenemhat III, whose daughter Sobekneferu succeeded him. Her name meant the beauty of Sobek. Pretty insulting since the god Sobek was a crocodile. The Middle Kingdom crumbled after a band of Semitic speakers called the Hyksos invaded and took over, but never managed to maintain control of Upper Egypt and its capital Thebes. Eventually the Egyptians succeeded in driving the Hyksos out, with Thutmose I as head of the New Kingdom, Egypt's most powerful epoch. This was the age in which kings were called pharaoh. It was also a time of unprecedented imperialism and expansion for the nation. It was as if Egypt wished to make up for its humiliating defeat by defeating others. Hatshepsut became the most famed of the few female pharaohs. She loved having things built, temples, shrines, obelisks, and wasn't shy about having a picture taken, or carved I should say. Here she is, complete with false beard. When her stepson, Thutmose III, took the throne, he proved to be the most militarily successful of all pharaohs, a consummate man of action, waging campaigns from Nubia in the south to Syria up north. He made Egypt the biggest it had ever been. Then along came the most unusual and intriguing of all pharaohs, Akhenaten. He was a radical, a man who quite unaccountably decided to worship only one god, Aten, a minor sun deity who was a sort of emanation of Ra. Akhenaten made Aten the chief god, and actively preached this new faith in a sort of monotheistic revolution that undoubtedly shook the whole priest class like a clap of thunder. They were happy to see him go, and his son Tutankhamun's reign signaled the return to religious normalcy. New Kingdom Egypt's peak in power was achieved under Ramesses II, who seemed to enjoy only one thing more than war, building statues of himself. Here are 4 Ramesses looking very proud indeed. This shameless piece of propaganda shows the pharaoh defeating an army by himself. He died in his 90s, and Egypt never never again attained the power and might it possessed under him. And while Ramesses III rescued Egypt from collapse in the end of Bronze Age Sea People invasion, decline was slow and steady. Libyan rule was followed by Nubian rule, followed by Assyrian rule, with Egyptians exhausting themselves to get back control each time, only for the Persians to conquer them, and then the Greeks under Alexander the Great, who founded the city of Alexandria. His general Ptolemy assumed control after he died, establishing a dynasty that ruled for 3 centuries. Alexandria became the scholastic capital of the world, a booming birth of braininess. Philosophers, mathematicians, poets, and scientists called it home and studied in the great library, as the famed lighthouse guided ships of scholars to the city. The Greeks ruled like the pharaohs of old, which of course included regal squabbles and conflict, which weakened the state despite the political romantic maneuverings of the last pharaoh, the famous Cleopatra, who killed herself via poison in 30 BC as the Romans swept in to take over the show. Rome revamped Egypt's economy, making it more efficient, and it soon became the richest province and the empire's breadbasket bastion of grain production. The first century saw the introduction and spread of Christianity, and Egypt quickly became one of its major hotspots, producing some of early Christendom's greatest theologians. The church in Egypt is known as the Coptic Church, Coptic being a form of the Egyptian language. As Rome split, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire, which, after centuries of wasteful war with Persia, was substantially weakened and ripe for the plucking, and Egypt was indeed plucked by the invading Arabs in the 7th century, bringing Islam and forcing a heavy tax on the Christians. These taxes saw several Coptic revolts against the Abbasid caliphs, which forced military suppression. The Shia Muslim Fatimid Caliphate conquered Egypt and founded the future capital Cairo in 969. They built Al-Hakim Mosque and Al-Azhar University. Sunni Islam returned with the Ayyubid dynasty. Around 1250, a powerful military slave caste called the Mamluks conquered Egypt, by which time Islam had become the majority religion. One of the greatest Mamluk sultans was Baybars, a patron of learning, who defeated the 7th Crusade as well as the Mongols. The Black Death devastated Egypt, leaving about 1/3 of its population dead. The Ottoman Turks conquered Egypt in 1517, but the Mamluks remained a powerful challenge to their authority, and Egypt remained very autonomous. French forces under Napoleon invaded in 1798 and defeated the Turks and Mamluks, but the British under Lord Nelson arrived to help turn the tide and send the French packing. Egypt was now battled over by Turk, Mamluk, and Albanian, with a remarkable Ottoman Albanian called Muhammad Ali, no, not that one, that's better, gaining power in 1805, who crushed the Mamluks for good. Ali Pasha undertook the task of modernizing Egypt, boosting the economy and establishing an improved bureaucracy and military. The mid-1800s saw British influence increasing as they built a railway from Cairo to Alexandria, and then the French organized the highly desirable Suez Canal, linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean for trade. Meanwhile, the Egyptians grew angry at the British presence and rebelled, leading to Britain conquering the country in 1882, taking the canal as well. After World War I, nationalist Saad Zaghlul pushed for Egypt's independence. Britain exiled him, Egypt revolted, and achieved independence in 1922, Zaghlul becoming prime minister and Fuad becoming king. Though Britain kept the canal, Egyptian anger at this expanded after World War II, when Britain was much weaker than it once was. When Israel was declared a nation in 1948, Egypt and a coalition of other Arabic-speaking states invaded but were not victorious. In 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the monarchy and became president the following year. He nationalized the Suez Canal, making it Egypt's, and Britain, France, and Israel were pressured not to invade by the US and Soviet Union. Nasser dreamed of a strong, united Arab world, but the region proved far too fragmented. He promoted modernization and socialist ideals, and suppressed the conservative Islamist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1967, Egypt began mobilizing its forces on the Israeli border. Israel then took Egypt by surprise by attacking first, rapidly and efficiently defeating Egypt's army and conquering the Sinai Peninsula. Nasser died in 1970 and was followed by Anwar Sadat. He led the Arab charge against Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and while Egypt initially had success, they faced stiff Israeli opposition and did not win. However, Egypt diplomatically regained Sinai in 1979, after Sadat made a peace treaty with Israel, much to the outrage of the Arab world. Sadat was assassinated by extremists in 1981, and was followed by President Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak faced problems of appeasing the Arab world while maintaining friendship with Israel, as well as addressing growing poverty and terrorism, targeting Christians, tourists, and selected government officials, which meant less people visiting because vacationers typically don't like being blown up. Naturally, this hurt the economy. The 2011 revolution ousted Mubarak, and an Islamist linked to the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, but the looming threat of totalitarianism prompted the military to topple him. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the head of Egypt's army, won the 2014 and 18 elections, and Egypt today faces a number of difficulties, but has attained a high level of human development and Africa's third largest economy. But what sits ahead for Egypt? Comment below, but for now, bye-bye!